Back in the 90s, talking about living on Mars sounded like something pulled straight out of a sci-fi movie. Electric cars were dismissed as slow and impractical relics, and reusable rockets weren't business plans. They were fantasies. The world didn't take these ideas seriously, because serious people didn't build their lives around impossible things. But somewhere far from Silicon Valley, in Pretoria, South Africa, there was a kid who didn't see fantasy. He saw a list of problems waiting to be solved. No capital, no network, no roadmap, just books, questions, and an obsession with the future that refused to stay hypothetical. Elon Musk wasn't supposed to reshape entire industries, and maybe that's exactly why he did. Because if the future belongs to those who think differently, then the real question isn't what gets built, but who is willing to take ideas everyone else ignores and treat them like they must exist.
So what kind of mind does that? What kind of person looks at rockets, electric cars, artificial intelligence, and doesn't see risk, but responsibility? This isn't the story of a man who followed opportunity. This is the story of someone who kept choosing paths where failure wasn't just possible, it was expected, again and again. Because in the end, Elon Musk is not defined by the ideas he believed in, but by the decisions he refused to avoid.
The outsider who read the future. Long before the companies, before the headlines, before the billions, there was just a quiet kid trying to make sense of a world that didn't quite make sense to him. Growing up in Pretoria, Elon Musk wasn't the kind of child who fit easily into his surroundings. He was introverted, often isolated, and frequently targeted by bullies. At one point beaten so badly, he had to be hospitalized. But instead of pushing him outward, the world pushed him inward. And inside that isolation, something unusual began to form. Back in his early teens, while most kids were still figuring out school, he was teaching himself how to code on a basic computer. Not long after that, he created a simple video game called Blastar and sold it to a magazine.
It wasn't a life-changing success, but it proved something important.
Ideas in his head could become real, even if only on a small screen. A few years later, his reading habits became his real education. Science fiction, physics, philosophy, he consumed them obsessively, not as entertainment, but as blueprints. The future wasn't abstract to him. It was something that could be engineered. Around 17, he made his first irreversible decision. Staying in South Africa meant a predictable path, including mandatory military service during a deeply conflicted political era. Leaving meant uncertainty, no guarantees, no safety net. He chose to leave. He moved to Canada, not because it was easy, but because it was a step closer to where he believed the future was being built, North America.
The transition wasn't glamorous. He took on odd jobs, cleaning, manual labor, anything to sustain himself while finding a way forward.
This wasn't a calculated career move. It was a directional gamble. Not long after that, he enrolled in university, eventually transferring to University of Pennsylvania. There, he studied physics and economics, two lenses that would later define how he saw the world, how things work, and how systems scale. But even then, the pattern was already clear. He wasn't chasing stability. He was positioning himself closer to possibility. Because at some point, quietly and without announcement, a belief had taken hold. If the future was going to be shaped by technology, then the only place to stand was at the edge of it. And that belief would soon collide with something much bigger than books or classrooms.
Because once you reached the environment where innovation was accelerating, the next step wasn't to observe it. It was to build inside it. Code, chaos, and the first millions. At first, it looked like momentum was on his side. X.com was growing fast, pushing into territory most people didn't even trust yet, moving money through the internet. But speed came with friction. Inside the company, disagreements weren't small, they were fundamental. Technology choices, leadership style, direction of the product, everything became a fault line. And then, while he was away on a trip, the decision was made without him. The board moved, quietly, decisively. He was out. Not gradually, not negotiated. Removed. The company he built, the one carrying his vision, continued forward without him at the helm. From the outside, it looked like a clean executive change. From the inside, it was something else entirely. It was loss of control.
The kind that hits deeper than failure. Because it wasn't the market that rejected Elon Musk. It was his own company. For a moment, everything he had been building toward fractured at once. Authority, gone. Direction, no longer his to decide. And perhaps most dangerous of all, the illusion that effort guarantees control was completely shattered. This was the point where most founders step back, protect what's left, avoid repeating the same mistake. But he didn't respond with retreat. He responded with recalibration. Instead of walking away, he stayed invested, quietly, deliberately. No longer the one making decisions, but still tied to the outcome. It wasn't pride anymore, it was strategy. Because somewhere in that moment, a shift happened. He stopped needing to control everything and started focusing on something far more powerful. Positioning himself to win, even when he doesn't. So, when the company, now known as PayPal, was eventually acquired by eBay, the result wasn't just financial success. It was validation. Not that he was right about everything, but that losing a battle didn't mean losing the war. And that realization would remove a fear that holds most people back for life. Because once you're no longer afraid of losing control, you become capable of risking everything. Betting everything on the impossible. Somewhere in the early 2000s, the tech world had already learned its lesson. After the dot-com crash, survival meant caution. Founders were building smarter, leaner, safer companies. Predictability wasn't boring anymore. It was necessary. But Elon Musk wasn't moving in that direction. He was moving away from it. A few years after walking out of PayPal with more money than he would ever need, he made a decision that didn't look like ambition. It looked like miscalculation. Instead of protecting his position, he stepped into industries that had crushed far bigger players before him. Not software, not platforms, but rockets and cars. Around that time, he founded SpaceX with a goal that sounded less like a business plan and more like a provocation. Reduce the cost of space travel and make life multi-planetary. The problem was, nothing about that industry was designed for newcomers. Rockets were controlled by governments, built by legacy contractors, and priced at levels that made failure catastrophic. So he asked a question most experts had already dismissed. What if rockets could be built cheaper and used more than once? At almost the same time, he took a controlling role in Tesla, then a small, uncertain electric car startup with more skepticism than support. Back then, electric vehicles weren't the future. They were punchlines. Limited range, weak performance, no real market demand. Now he wasn't just challenging one impossible system. He was challenging two. At first, it felt bold. Then reality began to answer. A few years later, SpaceX started testing its Falcon 1 rocket. The first launch failed.
Then the second, then the third.
Each explosion wasn't just a technical setback. It was public, visible proof that the model wasn't working. Investors hesitated. Confidence eroded. And internally, the pressure began to shift from optimism to doubt. Tesla wasn't doing better. Engineering delays stacked up. Costs surged. Production timelines slipped further and further away from what had been promised. The company wasn't scaling, it was stalling. And unlike software, hardware doesn't forgive mistakes cheaply. Every delay burned cash. Every miscalculation tightened the margin for survival. This wasn't a temporary dip. It was convergence. Both companies, different industries, different problems, were collapsing toward the same point, running out of time and money. Bridge after bridge failed to hold. Around that period, funding rounds became harder. Confidence became conditional. And quietly, without announcement, the situation became unsustainable. This is where most stories would split. Cut losses, save what you can, choose the stronger bet. But he didn't split. He held both. And then came the decision that turned risk into something else entirely. Instead of stepping back, he began pouring in his own capital, millions at a time, into systems that still hadn't proven they could work. Not because it was safe, but because stopping would guarantee failure. This wasn't diversification. This was exposure. Total exposure. Because by choosing to keep both SpaceX and Tesla alive at the same time, despite repeated failure, despite shrinking resources, he wasn't just betting on execution anymore. He was betting on endurance. That persistence could outlast probability. That pressure could force a breakthrough. And that belief would carry him right to the edge of collapse. Because when everything tightened at once, there would come a moment where he could no longer afford to save both. The year everything almost ended. Right around 2008, everything converged. Not gradually, not in isolation, all at once. By that point, Elon Musk wasn't managing risk anymore. He was inside it. SpaceX had already failed 3 Falcon 9 launches, 3 public attempts, 3 explosions, each one erasing not just capital, but credibility. In an industry where failure is measured in fire and debris, there isn't much room for patience. And there was only enough left for one more launch. One. No margin, no second attempt. If the 4th launch failed, SpaceX wouldn't just struggle, it would be over. At the same time, Tesla was collapsing under a different kind of pressure. The company wasn't failing in a single dramatic moment, it was bleeding out slowly. Costs had spiraled. Production delays had piled up. The Tesla Roadster program was consuming more money than expected, and revenue wasn't arriving fast enough to compensate. Payroll was in question. Suppliers were losing confidence. Investors were hesitating. The company wasn't days away from failure. It was hours. This wasn't 2 separate crises anymore. It was a collision. And at the center of it was a decision that had no good outcome. Because what he had left, his remaining capital, wasn't enough to save both. This is where most people choose survival. Cut the weaker one, preserve the stronger, walk away with something intact. But his thinking didn't follow that logic. Because from his perspective, these weren't just companies. They were missions. One aimed at extending life beyond Earth, the other at transforming how life exists on it. And choosing one meant abandoning the other completely. So instead of choosing, he did something far more dangerous. He split what he had left. Not equally in terms of safety, but equally in terms of belief. He wired the remaining money into both SpaceX and Tesla, knowing that if either failed, the pressure on the other would multiply instantly. It wasn't a hedge. It was a final bet that both could survive at the same time. And then, everything came down to execution. At SpaceX, the 4th Falcon 9 launch approached. There was no room left for error. Years of work, millions of dollars, and the credibility of the entire company were compressed into a single moment. The rocket lifted. This time, it didn't explode. It reached orbit. For the first time, a privately developed liquid-fueled rocket had done what governments and legacy contractors dominated for decades. It wasn't just a technical success. It was proof that the entire premise of SpaceX could work. And almost immediately after that, momentum shifted. NASA took notice. A contract followed. Not long after that, Tesla secured critical funding that kept it alive through its most fragile moment. Individually, each event might have been recovery. Together, they were survival. But survival came at a cost. By the end of that period, Musk wasn't operating from strength. He was nearly out of money, personally stretched, emotionally drained. The margin between everything working and everything collapsing had been thinner than almost anyone realized. This wasn't a triumphant breakthrough. It was a narrow escape, the kind that doesn't feel like winning. It feels like not losing. But something fundamental had changed, because once you've gone that close to the edge, once you've made decisions where failure means losing everything, fear doesn't disappear. It recalibrates. And from that point forward, the question was no longer whether he would take risks, but how far he was now willing to go. After the edge, a different kind of risk. Surviving 2008 didn't turn Elon Musk into someone more cautious. It did the opposite. Because once you've operated at the edge, where every decision carries the weight of total collapse, something shifts. Risk stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a tool. In the years that followed, both SpaceX and Tesla didn't just recover, they began to redefine their industries. By the early 2010s, Tesla moved beyond survival mode. The Model S wasn't just another electric car, it was proof that electric vehicles could outperform expectations. Faster, more desirable, technologically ahead. What used to be dismissed as impractical was now being taken seriously. A few years later, SpaceX pushed even further. Rockets that were once designed to be discarded after a single use were now landing back on Earth, controlled, precise, repeatable. It was something the industry had avoided for decades, not because it was impossible, but because it was too risky to pursue. He pursued it anyway. Bridge after bridge turned into breakthroughs. Tesla scaled production, navigating challenges that had nearly destroyed it before. SpaceX secured long-term partnerships, including missions that would carry astronauts, not just cargo. The narrative had changed, but the pattern hadn't, because the decisions driving these outcomes were still built on the same foundation. Move fast into uncertainty, accept failure as part of the system, and compress time by refusing to wait for perfect conditions. But the most important shift wasn't external, it was internal. After everything that had happened, his relationship with risk was no longer reactive. He wasn't simply willing to take risks, he was structuring his life around them, not recklessly, but deliberately. That's why new ventures didn't slow down, they multiplied. Neuralink, pushing into the boundary between human cognition and machines. The Boring Company, rethinking infrastructure beneath cities. Artificial intelligence, treated not just as a tool, but as a force that needs to be guided carefully. Each one operating in domains where uncertainty isn't a phase, it's permanent. To most people, this looks like overextension. Too many fronts, too many variables, too much exposure. But from his perspective, the logic is consistent. If the future is shaped by a handful of critical problems, then working on anything less is a form of avoidance. And avoidance, to him, is the real risk. Because safety doesn't build anything new. It preserves what already exists. So instead of optimizing for stability, he continued optimizing for impact, accepting that volatility, criticism, and failure would come with it. Public perception would fluctuate. Decisions would be questioned. Outcomes would remain uncertain. But none of that changed the direction. Because the goal was never comfort. it was acceleration. And once you define your life that way, there's no version of it that looks stable from the outside. Because in the end, the person who once feared losing everything became someone willing to risk everything repeatedly, not because it's safe, but because to him, it's necessary.
In the end, the story of Elon Musk isn't really about rockets or cars or even technology. It's about tolerance, not for success, but for uncertainty. Because most people don't fail because they lack ideas. They fail because they try to protect themselves from being wrong. They wait for better timing, more validation, less risk. But the future has never been built that way. It has always belonged to the ones who move before the outcome is clear, who act when the probability doesn't make sense, who accept that being early feels exactly like being wrong, until it doesn't. And that's the uncomfortable truth running through everything you've just seen. It wasn't confidence that drove him. It wasn't certainty. It was a willingness to stand in situations where failure was the most likely result, and move forward anyway. Not once, but repeatedly. Because at some point the question changes. It's no longer, what if this fails? It becomes, what happens if no one is willing to try? And maybe that's the real cost of refusing safety. Not the money, not the pressure, not even the risk of losing everything, but the decision to carry responsibility for things that don't yet exist and build them anyway. So when you look at the future, Mars, artificial intelligence, energy, space, the question isn't whether these things are possible. The question is, who is willing to treat them like they are inevitable before the world agrees?